So 75% of people overall use some form of social media. And in fact, if you look at young people, young adults, it's up to 90%. So it's hugely pervasive, and it has a lot of influence. I think the best example of this is the effect on the Arab Spring Revolution, which we saw in the news, and its contribution to the decline of print media. So it's pervasive and it's influential, but who cares? Who cares? I'm a busy clinician. I don't care if Kanye West has 100 billion Twitter followers. I'm a busy clinician and he's a deluded pop star. So the question is it useful or fun for us as clinicians? My name is Pearce Korb. I'm a member of the American Academy of Neurology and the Digital Strategy Subcommittee. And I hope to take you on my journey from someone who is quite a skeptic to someone who uses social media as a professional tool and hobby. So it all started about 8 years ago, 2008. I was a young resident and I was in Atlanta, Georgia. Twitter was only 2 years old and they just started using the hashtag as we know it today. I was skeptical, but like my generation, I had been using social media as a social, personal thing for a long time. I mean, I used Facebook quite extensively, but I'd never used it professionally. And as a young resident, I was starting to contemplate what my professional identity and reputation would be. Point in fact, I was actually quite nervous about using social media in this new context because I did have a new professional reputation to protect. So I was actually getting a little bit more cagey about my use of social media at that time. And a patient of mine actually wanted me to sign up for Twitter so I could follow him and sort of promote his more eccentric political beliefs. I took that home with me and had a chat with my wife on our evening walks, and we started talking about this newfangled Twitter. In fact, we couldn't figure out how can you say something meaningful in 100 characters or less. In fact, I proclaimed at that moment that Twitter would fail unequivocally. So don't ask me for stock tips because clearly I was wrong. But it still goes back to what about us as clinicians? And now I'm standing before you as a potential champion for social media for clinicians as a potentially useful tool. So how do I go from a skeptic to someone who now uses it quite successfully? In fact, I will tell you that my use of Twitter specifically has led to an online conversation with one of the most influential people in the world. So I'm going to take you on that journey from a skeptic to someone who now uses it relatively actively, professionally. So, a little bit of definition and terminology is fair. As you can see, I've included a lot of logos here. The word social media has a broad definition. It's any internet-based tool where you use to communicate with others, potentially collaborate, and exchange ideas. And because that definition is broad, we've got tons of platforms, apps, websites to use. I've included some common ones here, and I'm basically going to talk mainly about the ones I'm familiar with and the ones that I think you might find useful and fun. Some of the details are important, I will say, and if you do engage these platforms, I would know a lot about them before you do it. For example, we all are pretty familiar with Facebook, usually a pretty prolific social site that has a lot of functionality now. It used to be when I first signed up, you had to have the university email, but now it's clearly ubiquitous. But then there's also professional sites like Doximity, LinkedIn. These are more specific to our profession. I'm going to mention one specifically called Synapse because that's very specific to the American Academy of Neurology. So it's good to know because there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of privacy and expectations, and there's a spectrum of functionality in your audience when you use it. So, but again, what about us as clinicians? I mean, these are all good reasons to do it as any individual person. And how often do physicians use it now? Well, a little over half of physicians are involved at least passively in scanning a social media website weekly. But if you look at the numbers, it turns out the majority are people like myself who've been using it socially and privately now and not necessarily professionally. In fact, one survey said only 1/3 use it for professional networking purposes. Now, across the bedside, our patients definitely use this technology. This comes as no surprise to people who know they use Google and WebMD to find their medical information. About 1/3 of patients say they trust and get information from social media websites such that it influences their healthcare plan. And if you look at young adults in the patient population, 90%, a whopping 90%, say they would trust medical information that came from a social media source like Twitter. So we use it, but mostly personally and privately. Patients certainly use it in larger numbers, and therein lies a gap. And when there's a gap, there's opportunity. But I will say I'm very balanced about this. Where there's opportunity cost. Every minute you're on Facebook, every minute you're on Twitter tweeting out stroke precautions, or you're on LinkedIn searching for research collaborators, that's a minute you're not in clinic, that's a minute you're not doing procedures, that's a minute you're not with your family. And so I am balanced. I'm not going to overstate or oversell the usefulness of these technologies. And in fact, I think we should get away from what some other websites and proponents of social media will say, is that you should do it or you need to do it. If you're not doing it, you're missing out. We don't need that, okay? We don't need more shoulds. There's burnout rates way too high already. What we need is, do you want to do it? I will tell you, you can do it, but the question of whether or not you want to is very individual. Hopefully I can convince you you might want to, and if you want to, I can tell you how to do it right. So, one of the first ways that people get involved with social media is this, curating a library or news gathering. It's usually people's gateway, if you will, to social media. You could sign up for Twitter, and this is how I did it when I first got started, that skeptical guy back in 2008. I signed up for Twitter to sort of allow news to come to me in an effective way. If those familiar with RSS feeds or other ways to gather information quickly, there's tons of data on the internet, and this is one way to get it efficiently, effectively, and very much focused to your interest. I think the best example of that is my interest in something called MACRA. You probably heard of this by now. There's even a learning lab just across the hall on MACRA. But when it first came out, there wasn't much information about it except for deep congressional documents. And I have a business degree from undergraduate, but I'm not an MBA. And so I certainly didn't know enough about this, and I wanted to know as a hobby. And so I curated a list of people. They were medical healthcare journalists, other experts, lobbyists on Twitter that I followed passively to allow the information to come to me. Now, I will tell you, by this time, if I saw something useful, I would retweet it or re-engage it, sort of repopulate it. And in fact, I took some screenshots. If you type in MACRA, I took some screenshots right before the meeting. If you type in MACRA, so one of the things that comes up is a video from our very own Lyle Jones of the American Academy of Neurology, a very useful piece of information. And so this is one way that you can use social media even as a first step in its usefulness to you. So the second thing is advocacy. We all advocate for our patients in some form or fashion now. One of the best examples that I know of is Neurology on the Hill, straight from the American Academy of Neurology. Here's a picture right here. And we go to Congress, we lobby for our profession and for our patients and their families. And we even do this locally with advisory boards and other committees that we're involved with. We can certainly do this on the national and international scale with social media. Now, one would argue that I can do something as easy as when Ireland has their epilepsy day and they post it, I can repost that. I'm an epileptologist, so I try to advocate for people and families that suffer with epilepsy. And it can be as, complex as education as well. In fact, some people have gotten very sophisticated with this. They can do tweet-ups, online chats that are live, so patients and families can chime in and ask questions, and they can give general medical advice, and I'm going to get to that very point a little bit later. And I experimented with this. For those that don't know, there's something called Periscope, which is a sub-program of Twitter. You can live broadcast anything that you do with your smartphone. I could pull it out right now and broadcast the people in the audience, and anybody that was on Twitter could see this, log in, and text and interact with the person broadcasting it. Now, I was trying to think about what would be interesting to people that might check in with my Periscope, and fortunately, our institution was the third in the country to get a mobile stroke treatment unit. For those that don't know, this is a stroke ambulance, very fancy, has a CT scanner right in the middle of it, and they were literally rolling it out in front of our hospital. I thought that'd be a really cool thing for people to see, and I could use it as an opportunity to educate about stroke awareness and stroke treatment. So I did it, and the good news is people from all around the globe logged in and started chatting with me as I was showing them a tour of our mobile stroke unit. Bad news is their Russian was good and their English was not so great, and all they could ask me repeatedly was whether or not I liked vodka. So, I'm going to keep trying this, but again, people do use this very successfully. In fact, the influential person I mentioned had this kind of tweet-up activity, and that's how I had this conversation with them. And this is just an example of me doing the Periscope live broadcast to advocate for epilepsy awareness, as an example. Thirdly is network and collaboration, and I think the American Academy meeting is a great example of this. We come around once a year, we get together for a whole week, and we meet up with colleagues, we try to collaborate with new people, we go to business meetings, education sessions, but it's once a year. And these networking sites like LinkedIn and Doximity and Synapse communities are ways that we can keep in touch all year long. Even along the same line of interest, if we posted in a community that was interested in neurophysiology, we can maintain that link throughout the whole year, and people have done this successfully for a long time. The last reason that's stated is one I'm very skeptical of and want to mention to you: marketing. This is what you'll hear about the should. You need to. Your practice will fail without it. All of that, I believe, is hooey. The return on investment of this, your individual time, is probably low, and the evidence for it is absolutely zero. Now, if I was talking to a large healthcare practice or a hospital today, that conversation might be a little bit different, but I still think the ROI, the return on investment, is low for that. And so I like to get away from that idea that you should be doing this or you need to be doing this. I think the first three reasons are why you might want to do it instead. Oh, and this is just one of my recent posts before I got here. There's a nice picture of Vancouver, and I tweeted how excited I was about the meeting. And even within the first day of the meeting, I've been tweeting with the very few active tweeters of the meeting, and it's been an enhancing experience for the meeting itself. And there's another, Lyle Jones is another active tweeter at the American Academy, and he's posted about the different interactive learning labs that you're sitting in right now. So if you decide it's something you want to explore, how do you go about it? Well, first, you can certainly start passively. You can allow the news to come to you, but I would say start by interacting with people. Start by tentatively interacting with people and become a community. I would also use an advocating tool. I think it's a very easy way. If it's simply just retweeting a fundraising event happening in your community or abroad, that's a wonderful thing to do. I would talk to the top brass. If you work for a large practice or a university, for example, you might want to talk to even legal counsel to make sure they don't already have social media policies in place. Several places are hip to this, and they actually have policies about whether or not you do it and how you do it. So make sure you clear that at least. And if they say, I don't know what you're talking about, you're likely free to go and start. But if you do it, be a good citizen. I think as professionals, any professional mandate you have in public applies to social media. Don't bully, don't troll. That's slang for harassing people online. And be very professional. And it goes to what not to do. Don't use specific patient identifiers, obviously. Don't give out specific medical information. This one comes up because we want to give good information about, like stroke is my example. If I want to talk to people about the FAST acronym, how to recognize stroke early, that seems like pretty reasonable general advice to give. But if someone asks me a question about their husband's stroke and what they should do about it, you want to make sure you do your standard, please talk to your local neurologist or provider for specific medical advice. Don't argue or post controversial topics. I guess unless you're a tenured professor at one of these traditional universities, you probably can't get away with some inflammatory things. So make sure you keep it fairly non-controversial. And stop worrying about if you should do this. Again, I want to emphasize the idea that this should be fun. So a couple specific tips. If you decide that you want to try Twitter, for example, you could sign up for an account today. You don't have to fill out anything on profile, just put whatever name you want, and you could follow the hashtag AANAM. That stands for American Academy Annual Meeting. And you can follow any tweets that are basically about the meeting right now, and I think it'll enhance your experience. If that's too much for you, and I understand, another thing oh, by the way, this is what happens when you do it. Some very intrepid member has been posting what are the favorite and best restaurants in Vancouver. I found that very useful. She's doing the research for me about best noodle houses, and I found that via Twitter. So that's my another plug for the fun nature of social media. Oh, I don't want to reveal the punchline there. The other thing you can do is use Synapse. For those that don't know, you've probably been getting emails from the American Academy about the Synapse communities. These are message boards that are insulated by the American Academy. You have to be a member here to be a part of this message board. So it's a way to network, but feel a little bit more secure because it's a little bit more private. Okay? I would still be a good citizen. Try to be kind to your colleagues. Okay? You can probably post a little bit more controversial things internally, but please be, again, a good citizen. So I wanted to end on this, don't worry if you should. If you thought this was a pitch to say you absolutely have to be doing this, you don't. In my personal opinion, it's enhanced my life, but in sort of fun ways. And I do it after hours on my own time. It hasn't brought in new patients. I don't think it's really enhanced my reputation outside of being invited to the Head Talk. So really, it's more about what I get out of it as an individual human being. And I will say, again, I went from a skeptic in 2008 to someone who actively uses Twitter and finds it quite fun. And I was having a conversation with my wife, and she asked me, again, her very provoking political questions, how I felt about gun control. Now, I'm not going to talk about that. That's way too hot button topic. But my answer to her was, I don't know. I don't know enough about it. I'm kind of that way. I like to say, I'd like to read more about it. And it turns out the next day, a very important person was asking for questions to field. And I ended up asking that very question. What would this person think of gun control? And they answered back. And it was President Barack Obama. So he actually answered my tweet, and he gave me actual referential information. Now, I will say there's good and bad to this. My profile lit up. I got more profile clicks than I've ever had in my entire Twitter career over the last 5 years. But the amount of messages I got from the American populace about how they felt about gun control was quite extensive. I ignored all that, and mostly there. But I will say, actually, there was some good conversation about mental health issues that came about that I entertained and responded back, but I kept it very apolitical. So again, for me, it's fun, and I hope it ends up being fun for you too. I'll stay and answer questions and even help talk about the more specific hows to get involved with social media after the talk's over. And it's over now. I think I have one more plug to use, the hashtag AANAM. Easy for me to say. Great. Thank you so much for coming, everybody.